Social facilitation, or the audience effect, is the tendency for people to perform differently when in the presence of others than when alone, compared to the performance when alone. When in the presence of others, they tend to perform better on simpler, well-rehearsed tasks and worse on complex and new ones. The Yerkes-Dodson law, when applied to social facilitation, states that the mere presence of other people will enhance the performance in speed and accuracy of well-practiced tasks, but will degrade the performance of less familiar tasks. Social facilitation has occasionally been attributed to the fact that certain people are more susceptible to social influence, with the argument that personality factors can make these people more aware of evaluation. The audience effect is an attempt at psychologically explaining why the presence of an audience leads to people's performing tasks better in some cases and worse in others. This idea was further explored when some studies showed that the presence of a passive audience facilitated the better performance of a simple task, while other studies showed that the presence of a passive audience inhibited the performance of a more difficult task, one that was not well practiced, possibly due to psychological pressure or stress. History. Social facilitation can be defined as a tendency for individuals to perform differently when in the mere presence of others. Specifically, individuals perform better on simpler, well-rehearsed tasks and perform worse on complex and new ones. In relation to this, there are three main empirical relationships, which are the activation, evaluation, and attention theories. The activation theory describes how we are physiologically aroused and how that affects our functioning. The evaluation theory relates to the systematic assessment of the worth or merit of some object. The attention theory takes into account possession in the mind, including focalization and concentration of consciousness. In 1897, Triplett studied the effect on performance of having an audience. Triplett's experiment had a simple design. A cyclist's performance when alone was compared with the cyclist's performance when racing against another cyclist. He found that the cyclist was slowest when he was only racing the clock and not another cyclist. He attributed these results to a competitive instinct which releases energy that was not available when pedaling alone. Triplett's study started off a revolution of studies attempting to examine the theory that people's performance is influenced by the presence of others. In 1898, while studying the competitive nature of children, he found that children were much faster at completing the given activity while they were competing, which caused him to wonder whether or not simply having another individual that would have the same effect. To determine this, Triplett studied the race time of cyclists and found that cyclists had faster race times when in the presence of other cyclists. He theorized that the faster times were because the presence of others made individuals more competitive, and further research led Triplett to theorize that the presence of others increases individuals' performances in other non-competitive situations as well. In 1924, Floyd Allport coined the term social facilitation. Allport conducted studies in which participants sat either alone or with other participants and did a variety of tasks such as word association, tasks and multiplication assessments. He found that people performed better when in a group setting than when alone for the majority of tasks. However, at this time, social facilitation simply meant an increase in response merely from the sight or sound of others making the same movement. Hazel Marcus of the University of Michigan conducted an experiment to test the hypothesis that the mere presence of others can influence an individual's performance. A task that lacked a rubric structure and was likely to cause the subject to be apprehensive of how they would be evaluated was used. Performance times on the task of dressing and undressing in familiar and unfamiliar clothing were compared with subjects working alone. working in the presence of a passive inattentive person, and working in the presence of an attentive spectator, compared to the alone condition. Both social conditions enhanced performance on the well-learned aspects of the task of dressing and undressing with the subject's own familiar clothing, and hindered the subject's performance on the more complex aspects of the task of dressing and undressing using unfamiliar clothing. It was concluded that the presence of others is a sufficient condition for social facilitation and social interference effects. Therefore, the presence of an audience causes an individual to do better on a simple task or worse on a more complicated task. In a 2010 study, donation rates increased with the presence of observers, and neuroimaging revealed that the presence of observers significantly affected activation in the ventral striatum before the choice of whether or not to donate. In Rayflee's meta-analysis of the social facilitation phenomenon in 2002, three conclusions are made. Firstly, the presence of others heightens an individual's physiological arousal only if the individual is performing a complex task. Moreover, the mere presence of others increases the speed of simple task performance and decreases the speed of complex task performance. Lastly, social facilitation effects are surprisingly unrelated to the performer's evaluation apprehension. A study was done in 2014 that compared the performance of individuals with autism spectrum disorder to typically developing individuals on a task with the presence of another. The experiment conducted tested the hypothesis that an individual with ASD will respond to the presence of experimenters, thus altering the results of the experiment. Major theoretical approaches. The major three approaches to social facilitation of the activation, evaluation, and attention theories. The activation theory describes how our arousal relates to social facilitation. The evaluation theory discusses how being assessed by an audience affects to social facilitation. The attention theory takes into account the effect of distractions in the environment on social facilitation. Activation theory. In 1956, Robert Zajonc was trying to figure out why some studies showed people's performance being hindered by the presence of others rather than being made more accurate. He designed an experiment that would examine the performance of someone doing a simple versus complex task in front of others. He found that when people were performing a simple task in the presence of others, they could complete it with greater accuracy than when they were alone. This was something most psychologists were aware of at this time. However, what Zajonc found that was revolutionary in this time period was that, when people attempt to perform tasks which are more complex than with which they are not familiar, they complete it with less accuracy when in the presence of others than when they are alone. Thus, social inhibition was born. In 1965, Robert Zajonc developed the activation theory by proposing his generalized drive hypothesis for social facilitation. Zajonc's generalized drive hypothesis was the first theory that addressed why the presence of others increased performance sometimes yet decreased it at other times. He argued that the presence of others serves as a source of arousal, and heightened arousal increases the likelihood of an organism to do better on well-learned habitual responses. For this reason, arousal improves performance on simple or well-learned tasks, but impairs performance on complex or not well-learned tasks. Zajonc's reasoning was based on Yerkes-Dodson's law, which holds that performance works like an inverse U function. This means that an individual's optimal drive is higher for simpler or well-practiced tasks, and that the same individual's optimal drive is lower for more complex or less practiced tasks. The presence of other people further arouses us and increases our drive level, and so an individual's performance will be enhanced if a task is simple but diminished if the task is complex. He tested his theories by having people complete word association initiation tasks alone and again in the presence of others, and found that the tasks were done much faster while in the presence of others. Other activation theories include the alertness hypothesis, the monitoring hypothesis, and the challenge and threat hypothesis. Alertness hypothesis. The alertness hypothesis says that people are uncertain of how observers will act while in the presence of others, so they become more alert. It is this heightened alertness which causes them to perform better on tasks. Monitoring hypothesis. The monitoring hypothesis posits that social facilitation effects do not occur when the performer is familiar with the observers of the situation. This is because, in those cases, the performer knows how the observer will respond or how the situation will take place. Therefore, in such situations the performer's arousal will not increase. So, if the person is unfamiliar with the observers of the situation, he/she will experience uncertainty and arousal will increase, but not if he/she is familiar with them. Challenge and threat hypothesis. The challenge and threat hypothesis states that people perform worse on complex tasks and better on simple tasks when in the presence of others, because of the type of cardiovascular response to the task. When performing a simple task in the presence of others, people show a normal cardiovascular response. However, when performing a complex task in the presence of others, the cardiovascular response is similar to that of a person in a threatening position. The normal cardiovascular response serves to improve performance, but the threat-like cardiovascular response serves to impede performance. Evaluation approach. In 1968, Archie and Glass proposed the evaluation approach to social facilitation. Their evaluation apprehension hypothesis states that it is not the mere presence of others that increases individual activation, arousal, but rather the fear of being evaluated by an audience. They studied the reactivity of male high school and college students, where the responses were based on the strength they developed through prior training, and found that the groups who felt the performance was being evaluated had more dominant responses than the groups who were simply in the presence of an audience without being evaluated, or those that were alone. Learned drive hypothesis. A further extension of the evaluation approach is the learned drive hypothesis, which was developed by Cottrell, White, Sekeric, and Rittel, and states that activation only increases when actors feel that the audience is capable of evaluating the performance. In other words, it implies that the cause of evaluation apprehension comes from a learned audience. They studied how a participant performed on well-learned tasks while in the presence of an audience focused on another event, and in the presence of an audience focused on the tasks being performed. They found that participants performing in the latter group with the audience that was focused on what the participants were doing, largely gave dominant responses. Weiss and Miller further developed the evaluation approach by hypothesizing that activation only increases when the actors fear a negative evaluation. This theory suggests that activation increases when the audience or other competitors cause negative feelings, such as anxiety, in the actor. However, Good's development of evaluation apprehension takes the opposite approach, where he hypothesizes that activation increases when actors expect a positive evaluation. Because of the conflicting theories under the evaluation approach, there has been controversy over its reliability. A meta-analysis done by Bond found that even when individuals are in the presence of a non-visible and non-evaluative audience, activation still occurs for an increase in dominant responses. attention approach. In the 1980s, explanations shifted from activation theories to attention theories, which imply that withdrawal from some things is necessary in order to deal effectively with others. Attention theories that explain social facilitation include the distraction-conflict hypothesis, the overload hypothesis, the feedback loop model, and the capacity model. Distraction-conflict hypothesis. In his distraction-conflict hypothesis, Robert Barron proposed that the level of performance on a task is predicted by the amount of distractions in the environment surrounding the task. The hypothesis states that distraction leads to arousal, so the presence of others always impedes performance on difficult tasks. But the number of distractions in the environment either improves or impedes the performance on simple tasks. Overload hypothesis. The overload hypothesis works according to the distraction-conflict hypothesis, saying that distractors do not lead to increased arousal, but rather to cognitive overload, and while in cognitive overload, individuals will do worse on complex tasks and better on more simple tasks. Performance increases on simple tasks because the performers focus their attention on the new stimuli, instead of the irrelevant stimuli that is characteristic of simple tasks. Performance decreases on complex tasks because the performers focus on the distractors, but also need to focus on the relevant stimuli that are characteristic of complex tasks, and they cannot handle all of the information they are being presented with. Feedback loop model. The feedback loop model postulates that when people feel they are being observed, they focus attention on themselves. While in this state, individuals become aware of the differences between their actual behavior and anticipated behavior. So, by feedback loop model, people do better in the presence of others because of this increased awareness about the behavior. Capacity model. The capacity model of social facilitation focuses on the role of types of information processing on performance in front of an audience, rather than the performance on different type of tasks in front of an audience. The capacity model suggests that for tasks that require automatic information processing, the presence of others does not cause problems because the short-term memory is not required for automatic information processing, so performance quality increases. However, for tasks that require controlled information processing, the presence of others does impede the level of performance because the short-term memory is necessary to both focus attention on the audience, as well as the task at hand. Self-presentation approach. The self-presentation approach to social facilitation has two main theories, one regarding arousal and drive, and one without. The first theory argues that in the presence of an audience, individuals become concerned with self-presentation. The possible embarrassment that occurs with negative evaluation leads to activation of arousal, or increased drive, which will cause more dominant effects. The second theory argues that it is not an issue of arousal, but rather of simple responses, because the individual wants to appear competent in the presence of others. If the task is easy, the individual will want to make him/herself appear even more competent by doing exceptionally well on the task. However, if the task is difficult, they will fear that they will present themselves as incompetent, which will in turn make them embarrassed, and further impede the performance. However, there has not been significant research done or evidence supporting the self-presentation approach. The main study looking at this approach was done by Bond in 1982, but it did not include independent measures of self-presentation, so it was not able to conclusively prove the validity of this approach. Major empirical findings. Social facilitation and age. In 1898, Norman Triplet pioneered research on social facilitation by studying the competitive nature of children. In this study, each child was given a string and was told to wind it. He found that children performed much better while they were competing with one another, and further research led Triplet to theorize that the presence of others increases individuals' performances in other non-competitive situations as well. In 1973, Chapman ran an experiment and found that levels of laughter among 7 to 8-year-old children were highest when two children listened to funny material together. Furthermore, levels of laughter were higher when one child listened to funny material in the presence of another child than when one child listened to the funny material alone. These results indicate that laughter is also socially facilitated. Social facilitation and gender. In 1994, De Castro demonstrated that social facilitation affects food intake by extending the time spent eating a meal. His results also showed that the presence of family and friends, in comparison with the presence of mere companions, increases food intake to a greater degree, possibly due to the release of inhibitory restraints on intake that occurs when people feel more comfortable around people they're familiar with. Furthermore, males ate 36% more food when with other people than when alone, and females ate 40% more food when with other people than when alone. De Castro attributes this to the time extension model of social facilitation, as the time spent at a meal increased when the meal was a social occasion. These results suggest that the presence of other people at a meal increases intake by extending the time spent at the meal, probably as a result of social interaction, and that family and friends have an even larger effect, probably by producing relaxation and a consequent disinhibition of restraint on intake. Furthermore, these results also suggest that social facilitation has very similar effects on both men and women. Social facilitation and performance. In 1920, when asked to write out as many words as possible in response to a given word, 93% of participants produced more words in the presence of another person than alone. However, when this study was replicated with individuals who stuttered when they spoke, 80% of the participants produced more words when alone rather than in the presence of another person. Lee Edward Travis conducted a study to find what kind of effect an audience has on an individual. Travis used an eye-hand coordination test for his study. 20 freshman males, 1 sophomore male, and 1 junior male were used as the subjects. The small audience consisted of 4 to 8 upperclassmen and graduate students and was an equal number of men and women. Each observer practiced in the presence of the experimenter, and the learning curve was plotted each day. When the subject attained his maximum efficiency, the passive audience was brought in. Some of the subjects showed superior coordination when the audience was present. In June 1980, Forgas et al. Conducted a field study of audience effects, looking at the performance of expert and novice squash players when observed by no audience, a male audience, and a female audience. Contrary to Zajunk's drive arousal theory, it was found that the effect of an audience on performance did not differ significantly between novice and expert players. This indicates that the other factors, such as cognitive variables and players' interpretation of the audience's presence, also influence players' reactions to the presence of an audience in a natural setting. In 1982, people playing pool were being surreptitiously watched in order to identify skilled and unskilled players. Skilled players made at least 2/3 of their shots, whereas unskilled players missed at least 2/3 of their shots. When the observer moved closer to the pool table and continued to watch, skilled players' performance improved by 14% and the unskilled players' performance dropped by more than 30%. In 2007, Rosenblum et al. Studied archival data from Jerusalem in 2004 and found that the presence of an additional person in the car during a driving license test decreased the likelihood that the testee would pass the driving test. Although the nature of the study made it impossible to distinguish one explanation of social facilitation from another, the findings generally support the basic premise of social facilitation theory. In 2008, college students were given a list of words and told to copy them as quickly as they could. The easy task was to write out one list with their dominant hand, and the hard task was to write out another list with the non-dominant hand. While completing the task, they were in the presence of an image of the favorite television personality or an image of another character from the same show. When given the easy task, they wrote more words in the presence of the favorite character, and when given the hard task, the favorite character inhibited the performance, as shown. While the college students were given tasks, the favorite television characters are perceived as real in a social facilitation paradigm, which gives evidence as to how social facilitation can affect performance. In 2008, Hill, Hanton, Matthews, and Fleming studied suboptimal performance in spots, also known as the phenomenon of choking. Quote, "They determined that when individuals were worried about negative evaluations by the audience, and performing tasks that they were not familiar with, they often would perform at a lower level than when they did without an audience." In 2011, Hanley, Snyder, Nimon, and Arciero found that older adults riding cybercycles, virtual reality-enhanced stationary bikes with interactive competitions, exercised at higher rates than adults riding stationary bikes. In 2012, Murayama and Elliott conducted a meta-analysis where they found that the effects on performance commonly attributed to competition are actually due to performance goals. Competition prompts either performance approach goals, which are what facilitate performance improvements, or performance avoidance goals, which undermine performance. Social facilitation in animals. Social facilitation in animals is when the performance of a behavior by an animal increases the probability of other animals also engaging in that behavior or increasing the intensity of the behavior. In 1969, Zajonc, Heingartner, and Herman demonstrated that social facilitation occurs not only in humans, but also in species with limited or no cognitive processing. They observed that it takes a cockroach a longer time to complete a complex maze in the presence of other cockroaches than when alone. They also observed that in a simple, straight runway, a cockroach reaches the end of the runway faster in the presence of other cockroaches than when alone. This experiment lends support to the theory that physiological arousal resulting from the presence of others leads to similar social facilitation effects in animals as well. In 2009, Dindo, Whiting, and Aval studied the effect of social facilitation in capuchin monkeys. The monkeys in this study were required to complete a new foraging task, either alone or in a social group. While both sets of monkeys completed the task, those in the social group completed it 3 times faster than those monkeys that were alone. This increase in speed was attributed to observational learning and synchronization of behavior between group mates.